Hello all and welcome to Nothing Worth Saying. We've got a general election special for you. Boris Johnson managed to achieve what he'd been hoping for and perhaps even more by building a majority of 80 seats and winning 43.6% of the vote. So how did he do it and what are the consequences? We've got a crack team from across the political spectrum here to discuss that. So Ellis, why don't you run us through what you think were the key factors to start us off?
Well, the main factors are Brexit and Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think there's much Labour could have done on Brexit. I think the indecision cost them a bit. However, they were being outflanked on both sides by both the Lib Dems and the Conservatives. And regarding the leader, Corbyn was ipsos mori put him at minus 60, and he was almost 20 points below Boris Johnson to be Prime Minister. So I think at the end of the day, as politics becomes more presidential, that really hit Labour hard.
So would you say that Labour won the argument and Corbyn was bad, just disliked as a personality, or do you think it's a combination of both those factors?
I think John Pienaar was saying for the BBC, he said, if this is what winning the argument looks like, I wonder what losing the argument is. I do think the main issue was Labour in this election. The Tories went up, I think, 1.2%. Even the Lib Dems went up 4%. The main reason why Boris Johnson got such a strong majority was because of Labour going back 7.8%.
So why do we think that Corbyn was so disliked by the public, especially in those seats in the kind of the red wall and the working class areas? The only places that they've really managed to hold on to seats are metropolitan areas such as kind of around London, around Liverpool and Manchester, and then some other kind of university towns across the country. Why do we think people outside the Toon as well, of course? Why do we think that Corbyn was so disliked outside of those areas?
I think there's a number of reasons, though. There's one, the fact that he just kind of looks a bit like a nice old bumbling granddad. And a lot of people kind of couldn't really get past that. He just seemed, I mean, like when we were watching the first ITV debate, we were saying that his glasses were really wonky. And it just didn't help at all, does it? It doesn't help with his whole incompetence image that he has going on. And I think that incompetence boils down to the part, like everything, like the anti-Semitism debate. It boils down to his incompetence because regardless or not, if he is an anti-Semite, he was still he should still sort that out if he's trying to be a leader, and he never got it sorted out. It took 8 months to expel known anti-Semites from the party, while it took him 48 hours to expel Alistair Campbell.
Yeah, I think polls show the majority of people think Corbyn's an anti-Semite. However, the same poll also says that Boris Johnson is not a racist. I think his unpopularity has many strands to it. Firstly, he was never trusted to manage national security. For instance, his response to the Salisbury poisoning really impacted his approval rating. He wasn't trusted on the economy and even polled behind Boris Johnson on public services. And he presided over a party where the majority of MPs never really regarded him as fit to be Prime Minister. And then he didn't even have any moral authority because of what you were saying, the anti-Semitism issue in the party. And then you go on to Brexit, where he was not straight with the people on that. He sort of dithered around before he came to a position, and that made him look not very decisive at all.
Yeah, and the position itself was indecisive itself. That was a dither in itself, and I can see why Labour chose that position, because they've got, well, if we just go with revoke blah blah blah, that's going to annoy a lot of the Labour Labour Leave base, and also the Lib Dems already have that. But then if we go fully support Brexit, well, that's going to annoy, a lot of like the more central areas of our party. So I can see why they went with their position, but it just didn't work out because both sides saw it as crap, basically.
The main issue is the way he did it, I think. For instance, Labour lost an equal share of votes to the pro-Remain Liberal Democrats and Greens as they did to the Tories. They didn't appease both sides.
I think
you know who will?
Who?
Daddy Blair.
Wow. I do think it's funny though, the momentum reaction afterwards has been like, oh well, it's the centrists have forced Corbyn into this Brexit position, and you're like, well, in that case, isn't he just a bad leader? Which you think
he should stick to his guns.
Yeah, so it's like either you think he's a bad leader and he was forced into this position by people lower down than him in his party, or he's the problem. So it's like momentum's in like a funny place now where they're not sure how to defend Corbyn effectively.
You look at what the sort of Labour Leave policy was, as in that got absolutely decimated in the European elections by the Liberal Democrats and the Brexit Party. So would it really have made that much difference, do you think?
Either way, if they'd either had a different leader with the same Brexit policy or had had a different Brexit policy with the same leader. I think either way they wouldn't have done very well. They needed to change both.
Yeah, I think for me, there was a lot of bad factors at play. Corbyn, the Brexit policy, some of the individual policies themselves. I think some of the more radical economic policies just didn't really hit home with the public. They didn't believe that they were actually possible. I think with it being, we talked about the national security issues. I think with it being a very metropolitan kind of middle class movement, they didn't really touch home on the kind of law and order, patriotic issues that people kind of really resonate home with. So just looking at things like, you kind of saw these fake news articles about him being a terrorist sympathizer, whatever, whether that's an extreme example or kind of an exaggeration of the truth. The things that he's done that he just feels justified don't hit home well with kind of a lot of the people outside of the middle class metropolitan communities.
The failure to condemn the Salisbury attack. I mean, it's all well and good. It's all well and good, like supporting these groups in other countries, but when you are defending groups who have attacked your own country, I think that's when people start.
Yeah, with Salisbury as well, is that I retweeted a thing because I've been like kind of a fan of Corbyn, and I retweeted a thing where it was saying about how he was just completely wrong on the whole Salisbury thing. I was at the train station, I think, when it was happening, and straight away I got like 3 or 4 people like inbox me saying like, "Why have you retweeted this?" Like, it's just like, it was obviously Russia. Come on, like it goes back to the cult of Corbyn, doesn't it? There's this whole cult that, as much as I think he's got a lot of like good qualities, and there's a lot to like about him, but it kind of just boils down to, a lot of the time people just don't like the people who like him. And it was like, as soon as you criticize him, you get a lot of people talking about like how it actually is unbelievable, and Blair is the worst thing that ever happened, and so I think that turns a lot of people off.
Well, let's have a look at the age, sort of, because obviously you're saying about social media. I think Piers Morgan came out and was saying that Twitter lost the election. So obviously more young people use social media than old people, and of those aged 18 to 24, 57% voted for Labour, whereas the 65 plus, 62% voted for the Conservatives. So that shows a massive sort of age gap between.
The thing is, I saw this thing where the age where you're more likely to change, like you're more likely to vote Conservatives rather than vote Labour, it lowered. So I think it used to be about 45 or 46 at the last election, and in this one it reduced to 39, which I think is a big thing to consider, because it shows that Labour's not only starting to lose its like working class base, it's also starting to lose its, well, potentially anyway, its younger voters.
I think though that what we're saying, like it's starting to lose and things like that, in this election it sort of just lost people. But it's important to note, while there was a huge landslide, and obviously that's down to a number of factors, as we've said, I think that if you look at the individual seats, the Conservatives aren't winning by a huge amount.
What happened in 2017 was Labour kept a lot of seats, but the Tories gained a lot of votes. In this election, the vote share has just tipped the Tories over the edge in certain places, like Blythe Valley, for instance. So there is a chance that Labour could win them back, and there still was a lot of people who backed Labour in this election despite their Brexit stance. But the issue is 25% of Labour leavers switched to vote to the Conservatives, and that was enough to who voted for Labour in the last election. So that was enough to put the Conservatives over the edge and get them the seats they needed.
Well, Brexit's either like the gift to Labour, or it's like terrible for them after this, because if it doesn't go particularly well, which I think I'm probably skeptical that it will go well under the current plans as it stands, it has potential to go very well, so the Conservatives could win the next election. But if it doesn't go so well, it could be very good for Labour, because once Brexit's sort of like in name finished in a way, then that means that Labour can sort of fight on the issues again, and I think they do a lot better on that.
The thing is, as we were saying though, like a lot of the, again, we're talking about Labour leave. It wasn't just Labour leave. For instance, Labour only took 47% of the vote among those who voted Remain. That's less than half. And the Lib Dems took 21. The Conservatives still took 20% from those who voted Remain.
Yeah, well, as we've said before, I think that with the Remainers, there's not many people who actually were like agitating to stay in, or like of the people who voted in 2016, there weren't that many people who were like desperate to have another referendum and stay in, because there's like a very small percentage of Remainers who are like, yes, I want another referendum. Yes, I want to stay in, because a lot of people were like, okay, I'm done at this point. Just let's leave. Or they wanted to respect the result, or they didn't particularly like the Labour version of like remaining either. Their Remain pledge wasn't very appetizing to anyone. So
Yeah, and you've got to take into account the 13% of Remainers from this is from Lord Ashcroft's poll, who said that they just want to get Brexit. Sort of, they think the result should be respected, whereas only 5% of Leavers felt would vote Remain the next time round. So they're cutting their base short through the referendum route.
So I think we've pretty comprehensively covered where Labour went wrong and what went badly for them. I think one thing to touch on with the Lib Dems, so they went from around 7 to around 11% of the vote. So in terms of increasing their vote share, that's actually a reasonably impressive result. But in terms of where they probably would have hoped they could have performed in this election, both in terms of vote share and seats, I think they will have hoped they could do a lot better. Where do you guys think the issue has been there for them?
Yeah, so I think the main issue with the Lib Dems is they're expected to get a lot more Conservative Remainers on side, and they perhaps underestimated party loyalty. 66% of Conservative Remainers voted for the Conservatives, so that just shows that the Lib Dems couldn't win over those Conservatives, so they needed to win over to win seats in the Southwest, for instance.
I have to admit that I stayed up till I think it was about 4 to waiting to see if Jo Swinson was going to lose her seat, and she did. And at first I thought it was I thought it was quite funny, but then her speech afterwards was actually very she was very like gracious in defeat. So she's gained my respect for that, really. Because before I have to say, I think one of the issues that Jo Swinson had was she came across very patronizing. And I think like we come back to the whole presidential thing, like it's becoming more presidential. I got a flyer, well, it was basically a magazine, in fact, in my uni house in Bath. I don't know if you guys got the same, you might have done. And it had a big picture of Jo Swinson on the front, and it said the UK's next prime minister. And I thought, what? Like where are you getting this from? Like what are the polls telling you?
Yeah.
So I think the Lib Dems did run a pretty bad campaign as well.
They ran a terrible campaign.
The worst thing was that, did you see the thing on the bus where it was Jo Swinson's Liberal Democrats? They literally tried to base the whole campaign around her, without realizing she wasn't that popular.
Yeah, she's not particularly likable. She seemed to be, Boris Johnson has a lot of problems, and Jeremy Corbyn has a lot of problems with him. But I found Jo Swinson maybe not the most unlikable, but the most annoying.
Yeah,
I think it speaks to that patronising point you talked about earlier. Definitely does have an air of that.
The issue with them is their position screwed them over as well. And you've got to think, what could they have really done about it? Because you had Conservative Remainers who they needed to win over, thinking, oh, well, she'll just prop up a coalition with Corbyn. And the last thing these Conservative Remainers wanted was Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister. And then you had on the other side people thinking, oh, well, she'll just prop up Boris Johnson. So she was sort of undercut from both sides, really, I thought. The position to move to revoke was a mistake because it's a very radical step, and she's trying to win over voters who aren't that radical.
Not only are you alienating every single person who voted Leave, you're also alienating a lot of people who believe that the referendum should be respected.
Exactly. So you're cutting into a small base of support anyway. There was no broad church within the Liberal Democrats in this election, for sure.
So let's move on to next steps and what we think the effects of this election are going to be. So first of all, what do we think is going to turn out over the next kind of short period of time with the Tories in government in terms of the next stages of Brexit, any other kind of policies and things that they're going to implement or perhaps row back on?
I think they're going to pretty sharpishly in the new year put through the bill, the withdrawal agreement, everything. So we're going to have Brexit on track, as it were, fairly soonish. Already seeing quite a bit of potential rowing back from Johnson and the Conservatives, particularly regarding some of the campaign pledges.
The Hancock on BBC explaining what everyone had said about how 20,000 of those nurses are already in place and doing an awful job of explaining that.
So, I mean, it depends on if there's going to be a cabinet reshuffle in the new year and maybe some more sort of one nation liberal Tories end up in the cabinet, which would be, I think, a step in the right direction for Johnson if he's trying to make a more coherent sort of Brexit strategy long term in terms of the future arrangement. Because you don't want just a hard line liberal and traditional trade sense Tories in your cabinet. You want a sort of a broader church so that you can have a more I think more coherent economically Brexit policy. So I think that's probably what we're going to be seeing soon.
A lot about how these votes in the North and in the Midlands are lended to them and how they need to kind of respect them and treat them kind of correctly. How do they couple that with the more traditional kind of economic policies that you spoke about some of the more right-wing members might want? How do they manage to kind of please both sides of that?
Well, I think firstly there will be a lot more investment in. They'll have to invest in the North. Conservatives have got a big issue because they're appealing to demographics that are very, very different to each other. The only sort of, I think, you've got obviously the elite people who are very economically conservative, and the people in the North now are very economically liberal. So I do believe that he will have to start funding the North far more than he is, and he has put through the £34 billion NHS bill. I think that will be one of his big priorities. He will have to fund the North to keep those seats because, as we were saying earlier, it's quite marginal in those constituencies. I think Brexit will have to be done straight away. I think there'll be a cabinet reshuffle relatively soon, a small one to start with, but then a big one. And if I was a betting man, I think Priti Patel will be out of the job as Home Secretary. The top 9 people wheeled out to do media appearances for the Tories were all men, and the 10th was Nicky Morgan, meaning that Priti Patel wasn't even in the top 10 people to do media appearances. So I think that shows she's being sidelined slightly.
If you're choosing Nicky Morgan over anyone, you know that they're not very well trusted.
I also think that the Fixed Term Parliament Act will go. And I think, as we've seen, that will be quite a positive step, really. I don't know about you guys, but I'm not a fan of the Prime Minister unilaterally determining when there's an election. However, from what we've seen, shows that the Fixed Term Parliament Act in its current guise doesn't work.
Yeah, I think that, well, the Fixed Term Parliament Act solved a very short-term problem of the coalition, but it also didn't anticipate we'd go into a period where people couldn't win majorities.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone thinks that we're now past that period permanently. So I think the Fixed Term Parliament Act realistically probably should go.
Thing is, in usual times, the opposition would be pressured into agreeing to an election. However, this opposition, they really didn't want an election. And perhaps you look at people like the Lib Dems, the Greens, and the Remain Labour. By backing the election, they've ruined their chances of stopping Brexit, because for a period of time they had Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the corner, really, didn't they? They could almost do what they wanted with him. However, now he's got an 80-seat majority. He's got the most united party in Parliament, other than perhaps the SNP. He can do exactly as he pleases, and that's all because these MPs agreed to his election.
Well, what do we think will happen with the SNP now that they have such a
Absolutely nothing. For at least 2 years, nothing.
Well, let's say Nicola Sturgeon's pushed for a second independence referendum, hasn't she? And she's tempted to perhaps go to the courts regarding it, which will be interesting. Do I think she'll win that battle? Probably not. I think it's hard to see where the SNP go from here and how they get their referendum, because Johnson specifically said in his campaign, vote for Labour, that's a vote for Scottish independence referendum as well. So he really will not want to go back on that decision.
Yeah, I think that's something that isn't sort of addressed very often in the sort of post-election analysis, is the fact that in Scotland, Labour were the big losers. They lost to SNP, so sort of
again for the second time.
Labour never won an election without winning Scotland or winning a significant portion of Scotland. So it's sort of,
and that's partially because they position themselves in an almost like a anti-unionist position in being willing to grant the SNP a referendum, with McDonnell coming out and saying it will probably be on the table. The Conservatives basically took up all the unionist vote, and that's why they did relatively well, even considering how anti-Brexit Scotland is.
Yeah, I think there's more of a danger of losing Northern Ireland in the Brexit process than there is losing Scotland.
Well, did you see Northern Ireland's got more nationalist MPs now than unionists for the first time ever?
Exactly. So I think that's potentially what we might see before the end of the whole Brexit process would be Ireland reunifying, because I think the ties to the UK are weakening. I mean, the withdrawal agreement itself weakened them significantly, and I think that unionists being elected sort of tells you what you need to know about how people saw that in Ireland or Northern Ireland.
The issue will be where Labour goes. Well, I know we're talking about the Tories, but how do Labour overturn that majority without Scotland? As you were saying, like they've never won. What was your stat again? I can't remember. But,
well, they've never won an election without Scotland.
Exactly, and that now they've lost even some of their heartlands in the north.
Yeah,
it's going to be even harder to claw back.
Yeah,
from where
and a lot of the Welsh vote as well. I mean, they did seem to fairly comprehensively lose a nice broad area of the UK. But I mean, yeah, they can't do anything if they don't win back their like Northern Wall, Scotland, and Wales.
Tom, I think you're forgetting the important point is that they won Putney.
That is true. They did win Putney.
The issue is though, Labour took these areas for granted. That's what our friend Ben, who lives up there, was saying.
Completely.
Yeah.
And that's shown again, but I don't want to go back to Labour, but it's shown by their referendum position.
Well, talking about Labour, shall we go into what we think they need to do next? So starting off with what perhaps they need from a leader, and then who we think the best leader for them might be.
Well, looking at the odds, obviously, Tom, you love to bet. Keir Starmer is 13-8, Rebecca Long Bailey is 9-4, and Lisa Nandy has gone down from 6-1 to 3-1.
In the course of you saying that, he did open up Bet365.
I was going to get the odds up to check them, but I didn't.
Yeah, sure, pal.
He's just betting. He's betting on the football. He's not betting on the bloody league.
Oh yeah. Actually, what's El Clasico score right now? Is it no one else else?
I don't know, but
you've got money.
I'm going to pour some money on total corners and yellow cards. That's how you know it's serious.
I think regarding the leader, I would quite like Starmer or Cooper. I think they're both fairly decent. I think the Momentum's grip on power is very strong in the party, so I think that I would be surprised if it wasn't a Momentum-backed candidate.
Momentum need to be clever with backing someone, because they'll probably back Long Bailey, won't they? With her being McDonnell's understudy. But McDonnell seemed to be someone that, even if people didn't like Corbyn, they thought he was all right. And Long Bailey just doesn't seem to get that kind of respect at all, really. People just see her as a bit incompetent.
Well, speaking of McDonnell, he told Andrew Marr recently it was time for a non-London MP, which seemed to rule out his backing for Keir Starmer and Emily Thornberry. And he said he'd prefer someone else to Jess Phillips, which I think is being very political about it.
Thornberry would probably be a terrible choice, to be honest, just because
I think also you've got to look at the name recognition. Like, who has the name recognition in the Labour leadership to, or the top echelons of the Labour Party to become leader? And I think Starmer's one who has a lot of name recognition. Whether or not you like her, Emily Thornberry does also have name recognition.
I think
I
she
don't
does for
know
the wrong
if Long
reasons.
Bailey necessarily has it in the same way.
Reportedly on the doorstep, a lot of people who said they didn't like Corbyn did say they did like Keir Starmer. I do think the problem with him is he's been very avidly pro-Remain.
Yeah.
If Brexit is dealt with, then perhaps that won't be as much of an issue going into the next vote. But I could still see that being an issue, because kind of people looking back at this time and thinking, oh, well, he wasn't with us then. And that being a limit on this amount of support he could win back in those northern areas in the next election.
I was just thinking what your thoughts are on Labour moving towards the centre ground. I think Labour's economic policies were cited as the third most popular choice as to why people who didn't vote for Labour didn't vote for them. But the thing is, individual policies are quite popular with people. For instance, a poll published by Populus found that 83% of people support public ownership of the UK's water, 77% electricity, 77% gas, and 76% railway.
Well, they should do, because half the time, it's not just private ownership; it's private ownership by foreign governments. So it's kind of public ownership by a different bloody country.
Yeah, what it does show is there is some popularity for nationalising things. It's just the extent of what Labour tried to do, I think, is the main issue for them. You even have people like John Lansman coming out and saying our our manifesto was a manifesto for the next decade, not for the next government. And yeah, 12% of people said that they didn't vote Labour specifically because they thought the economic cost would be too high.
But I think that that's more an issue with branding. I think that's more like how Labour marketed itself, and again, it's more of a failure of leadership. Because as you said, like the policies themselves were quite popular. It's just, and people have said, oh, it's because you can't cost it and you can't justify the pricing of it. And I think that that got said about Ed Miliband's manifesto as well. Even the Conservative manifesto, the IFS were like, they had questions about how he was going to cost it. It's just that I think that the Conservatives are also more effective in how they explain things away, certain people aside. Whereas Corbyn and Labour weren't very effective at explaining it convincingly. So whether or not people,
I think the issue with the IFS is that they were concerned that the Tories they thought there'd be basically more tax increases to pay for it, basically. Whereas with Labour's, they specifically said this cannot be done within the next 5 years. And I think even when you have people like John Lansman from Momentum saying, oh, all this stuff couldn't be done within the next 5 years, and that was the problem, I think that shows that perhaps you need to be less idealistic and less focused on the next 10, 20 years, and you've got to focus on proposals that you're going to do in the next 5 years. If they're just solely focused on popular policies, like nationalising the railway, for instance, I think they'd make a success of it. But because nationalising the railways was caught up in other policy proposals that they tried to implement, such as tuition fees, people thought they were just giving away loads of free stuff that the country couldn't afford.
Yeah, and I think that also if you're gonna, if they were gonna go with that, this is a manifesto for the next 10 years. Well, they should have explained that. They should have been like, which again is back to the leadership point. Is like, if you want to go down there, this is how we want to change the country. Explain how you're going to do that longer term, rather than say we're going to do all of this right now. Be like, oh, actually, yeah, we are going to maybe progressively lower tuition fees. Maybe we are going to renationalize things over a longer term period. But they didn't do that. They just said we're going to do it straight away. It just made it seem less well thought out.
Yeah, I think you're right there. But what I do think that was the benefit of this Labour manifesto is it's made the Tories move to a more spending pledges. And I think when Corbyn's saying he'd won the argument, he did win the argument in the sense that austerity is now sort of over. The government has pledged to spend vast amounts of money, which they haven't spent in the past 9 years. So Corbyn has had some success.
Environmental concerns as well.
Exactly.
The Conservative government under Boris Johnson, who would have thought that the Conservative government under Boris Johnson would be talking about being carbon neutral by 2050?
Well, Boris Johnson was quite pro-environmental when he was London mayor. Not as much as Sadiq Khan, but and even if you look at Boris's tone since the election, it's been far more sort of One Nation-esque and more conciliatory. Whereas before, his message was literally just get Brexit done. And we were laughing in the debates, weren't we? Because anything Corbyn said, Boris basically responded with get Brexit done.
He didn't care. He literally didn't care about anything, did he? Yeah, Corbyn would be talking about how austerity is bad and how Boris was a bit racist, and Boris would be like, "Sorry, what? Get Brexit done? Never mind." And the crowd would love it.
Yeah, it resonated with the average voter.
And it did, and that's what won him the Corbyn being a bad candidate also lost in the election, but Boris is simple, because let's face it, the Tory manifesto was pretty bare bones, and the main thing was get Brexit done, and that's what won him the election. So I think
the Tories learned from the mistakes of 2017 when Theresa May's manifesto was hated, basically.
Yeah.
So I think it's Isaac Levido, who they've got a new chant, which we might be hearing at Glastonbury, which is, "Oh, Isaac Levido." I'm sure we'll get Paul McCartney chanting that. But the Tory campaign strategist basically identified the problems of the previous campaign, which was the lack of spend, which was austerity, basically, and rectified that, but kept the Brexit message of get Brexit done. Mm-hmm. And it just sort of tore Labour apart in the heartlands.
So yeah, I hope the Tory spending pledges work, but it just does seem that they're being rolled back a bit already. With this 50,000 nurse thing, it was already, like, from the beginning it was said, well, actually no, it's 31,000 nurses, and now they don't know how they're going to keep these 20,000 nurses that are already there.
And
So I
that
think
was
Labour, this is things that Labour needs to already be taking notes on, and I
exactly.
think
Yeah.
that they need to, they're in a weird position where they need to straddle the whole kind of, maybe not Corbynism, because Corbynism is now going to have a terrible precedent under it, but they need to straddle this kind of far left. Go back to the broad church thing under Blair, but the thing is, Blair's broad church ended up just being, I'm Blair and I'll take us to war if I want to. And now everyone hates Blair because, and everyone likes to point out that, he's the only person who's won by the time of the next election, he'll be the only Labour leader who will have won an election in 50 years. But that's before people hated him. People hate him. And
Yeah.
they can't go back to just idolizing Blair because people don't like him, but also people don't like Corbyn. So they need to kind of make sure that they keep keep a lot of radical policies while trying to present themselves to everyone, which is going to be a very difficult task.
Well, Blair's one of the reasons they lost the working classes.
Exactly.
The working class move away from Labour started in 1997 dramatically.
Yeah.
So that is a part. But the thing is, the issue with Boris, I found, was trust. He was making up the nurse figure was ridiculous, I thought, because there wasn't 50,000 new nurses. And then people had trust issues about Boris's history anyway. The thing is with Labour, by presenting all these spending pledges, they had a trust problem also, because people didn't think they could do all they were saying to do. If they'd perhaps gone a bit less idealistic, perhaps, then they might have put forward a manifesto that could be implemented in 5 years, and they could fully cost that within the 5 years, and then take voters away from Boris Johnson.
And then I think also the trust thing is like, if you don't trust either, and like maybe people trusted Corbyn slightly more than they trusted Johnson, it's about also whether you like them. And if you don't like Corbyn as well as don't trust him, but you can like Johnson and not trust him, then obviously he's going to easily win against Corbyn.
How do you think Labour wins back these voters from the north, from Wales, who are predominantly in working class occupations? And how do they straddle that with the intellectual liberal elite who were backing them quite comprehensively in London? Well, I know Johnson has his own problems in straddling now the shires with Blythe Valley, for instance. He's going to have great difficulty in that, but also Corbyn's got to try and build a tough electoral coalition as well.
I think that it's going to be getting back the Leave voters will be helped by leaving. So once we've left, then the main classic heartland issues of, the NHS and all of that sort of stuff, Labour can start to win back their support again. And there won't have to be this sort of straddling. And then I assume they're going to hope that the liberal elite come with them with the policies they're going to propose, such as like nationalisation, which seems to be fairly popular in sort of like London, university town sort of areas, as well as with working class families.
Because a lot of people in working class occupations, like manual workers, are far more socially conservative than the socially liberal people in the say the London metropolitan elites. Perhaps social factors will play a big part of the next election from the Conservative side, because obviously Labour will pledge to spend a lot of money economically, and the Tories no longer have the social incentive of Brexit. So it'll be interesting to see how they try and maintain the coalition they currently have, and whether they'll base it on a more socially conservative platform.
Yeah, I think one of the things with Brexit was the fact that it was a vote. It was a vote for change, wasn't it, Brexit? One of the big things about Brexit was that it was a vote for change. And I think austerity's finished, as you say. But if things still don't change with Brexit, which I can't imagine in places like Sunderland, like the Blythe Valley, I can't imagine these big these industrial port areas, working class port areas, are going to do too well in the first, say, 5 years of Brexit. So if that change doesn't happen, or if things get worse, then that's how Labour needs to capitalise on that.
And these aren't big enough majorities to basically make the Tories win in these constituencies. These constituencies have no loyalty to Conservatives whatsoever.
No.
If anything, they're slightly distrustful. So when Brexit is done and taken out of the way, the Conservatives own all the consequences of that, as we were saying earlier, and Labour can hit home on these economic policies that are popular.
I think Brexit needs to go incredibly well for the Tories to keep these seats, to be honest.
Yeah, you're right.
That's no, wow, what incredible political analysis that was, Joe. But you know what I mean? Like it's just that's a problem that the Tories now have. They need to deliver Brexit, like, so, even if it's just for their own sake of keeping a majority for the next government, they need to deliver Brexit well. But I can't see much happening in the next 5 years. Well, not the next year anyway. 2020, nothing's going to happen.
Do you think that
after
electing a leader like Lisa Nandy, who's the MP for Wigan, so John McDonnell said not a London MP because he thinks that Labour need to get out of this London bubble, and it is true that a lot of Corbyn's shadow ministers came from London constituencies. Do you think an MP like Lisa Nandy, representing Wigan, and also has called for compromise on Brexit before, perhaps could she win over these sort of northern voters, perhaps?
I mean, maybe. I mean, look at what happened with Andy Burnham. People just kind of thought he was a bit boring, didn't they? So I don't know.
And I think with Keir Starmer, people keep saying that Keir Starmer's always part of this London bubble. He was the son of a nurse and a toolmaker, I think.
Yeah.
So perhaps he could play that to his advantage.
And he seems to be the one who is most on board with this whole, we need to keep a lot of Corbyn's radical policies because they were A, popular, and B, we kind of actually do want to change the country, but also we need to incorporate more wings of the Labour Party and not just like cast out Blairites like Alistair Campbell. And we also need to be more competent in sorting out problems within our own party, such as anti-Semitism. So I mean,
and he's perceived as competent, I think.
He's perceived as competent. I think with Long Bailey, she seems to not be.
The issue with Long Bailey is she's too close to Corbyn, perhaps, and that whole brand has now been proven.
Well, especially if she's John McDonnell's protege, basically, but not as popular as McDonnell.
No, but I think again McDonnell suffers with the same problem. He's too closely tied to this Corbyn project.
Exactly,
I think he said himself, like, this failure's on me.
Yeah, he's going. So he's not in the ring. Thornberry's got way too many problems with her. She's basically just insulted every working class person on the planet.
I mean, I can't see her winning an election because the Conservatives can literally look at that. I think the Welcome to Rochester thing with the England flag, which she took the mick out of. Then she described Caroline Flint's, well, allegedly, let's say, she described Caroline Flint's constituents as more dumb than hers. I can't see her winning over these working class people.
Yeah, I think that Starmer could be a unifying figure. I think that they've got to be careful with doing more of the same Corbynism. They need a significant sea change to sort of be able to reputably say they're a different party now, reputably say they've learned from the mistakes of this election. I think Starmer's potentially enough of a difference. I think Cooper as well could potentially be enough of a difference for them to be able to do that.
As well. I think Cooper with Cooper, she'd be very good as as the leader of the opposition, just standing across from Johnson. She's very good at rinsing people. So it'd be quite good to see her just rinse Johnson.
And they also both benefit from being kept relatively out of the limelight during the election.
Cooper was basically a backbencher, wasn't she?
So because Corbyn, they didn't fit with the Corbyn agenda fully, it sort of helped to keep them out of the limelight, which benefits them because they're relatively untainted by this election, I think, which means that they can sort of learn from it, improve on it, and sort of be the change the party needs.
Starmer is. I think we're going to say the same thing. He's tainted by his Brexit stance, isn't he?
Oh yeah.
But if Brexit goes badly, I mean, you don't want him to be saying, "Oh, well, look, I told you so." But at the same time, if Brexit does go badly, that could play into his hands.
Yeah, and like being tainted by your Brexit stance is better than being tainted by this election result, really. I think.
Yeah. The issue is the moderates have never been really organised within the Labour movement, whereas Momentum is, whatever you say about them, they're a very organised and effective force.
Yeah.
And when they throw their weight behind a candidate and it's looking like one of Angela Rayner or Rebecca Long Bailey, they'll be very hard to beat. And the issue with Yvette Cooper is that she is perhaps known to be a Blairite, perhaps.
Yeah, especially being Ed Ball's husband, yeah.
However, yes, that could work in her benefit. He's very popular on Strictly. Maybe she can get a popularity boost from Ed.
I think
You
Keir
bring
would
him
do
back.
well. I think Keir would do well on Strictly. To be fair, like he'd be quite popular with the the mums. So
I was
You
saying,
know.
I was so shocked he's 57.
yeah,
He looks very good for his age, I
he
think.
does
He's
look very
how
good for his
old?
age.
57, Tom.
Impressive. Yeah, wow.
Maybe we'll have a P-MILF.
That sounds like a great note to finish on. So, yeah, I think that was a pretty interesting discussion. Very much centered around Labour and where they went wrong and where they can kind of perhaps move forward in the future and what they need to implement. So, thank you for listening, and we look forward to talking to you next time.